The alarm cut through the command bunker like a blade. Red light washed over the walls as Laura Bennett gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. On the main screen, a massive shape hung silently above the Pacific Ocean, blotting out a portion of the stars. It had arrived without warning, without sound, and without mercy for anyone's nerves. "Confirm visual," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. "Confirmed," answered a technician beside her. "It's real. It's here, and it's not alone." 3 more shapes shimmered into view on the radar feed, spreading out in a slow, deliberate formation above the planet. Nobody in that room had trained for this moment, because nobody believed it would ever come. For decades, scientists had searched the sky for a whisper of another civilization. Now the silence had broken all at once, and the answer was standing directly over their heads. Within an hour, every major government on Earth had received the same transmission. It arrived in every spoken language, translated with impossible precision, carrying a message that would change the course of human history. A voice, calm and without emotion, introduced itself as speaking on behalf of an organization called the Galactic Council, an alliance said to include hundreds of intelligent species spread across countless star systems. The message requested, though it sounded more like a command, that Earth send representatives to a meeting aboard the lead vessel within 48 hours. Laura Bennett was one of 7 people chosen from her country to attend. She had spent 15 years as a linguist and diplomat, fluent in 6 human languages, but nothing had prepared her for what waited beyond the atmosphere. As she boarded the transport shuttle sent down from the alien ship, her hands trembled slightly, though she kept her face composed. Beside her sat Ethan Carter, a former Air Force pilot turned government liaison, quiet and watchful, his eyes tracking every detail of the strange vessel's interior. The corridors inside the alien ship were smooth and pale, lit by a soft glow that came from no visible source. There were no sharp edges, no wires, no machinery in sight, only clean curves and silence. It felt less like a ship and more like something grown rather than built. Laura tried to memorize every detail, aware that whatever she reported back would shape how billions of people understood this moment. They were led into a wide chamber where a single figure stood waiting. It was tall, with pale gray skin, and large, dark eyes that seemed to calculate rather than simply see. It wore no obvious clothing, only a smooth covering that shifted color subtly as it moved. When it spoke, the sound came out even and precise, each word chosen with care. "I am Threl Khan," the figure said. "I represent the Council in this matter. You may consider me your point of contact." Ethan stepped forward slightly, his jaw tight. "You've been watching us." "For how long?" "Long enough," Threl Khan replied, without hesitation. "Long enough to understand your patterns, your conflicts, your instability." The words landed like a slow, cold weight in the room. Laura felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice level. "We're here to discuss cooperation, not to be judged." "You misunderstand," Threl Khan said. "Judgment has already occurred. What remains is deciding what to do about the results." Over the next several hours, the delegation was presented with what the Council called an offer. Earth would be granted what they termed provisional membership in the wider galactic community. In exchange, humanity would receive limited access to advanced medical technology and clean energy systems, enough to end hunger and disease within a generation. It sounded, on the surface, like the greatest gift ever offered to any civilization. But the conditions attached to it told a different story. Earth would not be permitted to develop long-range space travel beyond its own solar system. All weapons research above a certain threshold would need to be reported and approved by a Council oversight committee. A small fleet of observation vessels would remain stationed in Earth's orbit indefinitely, monitoring compliance. And any decision made by Earth's governments regarding these terms would need unanimous agreement from every recognized nation, a requirement the Council surely knew was nearly impossible to achieve peacefully. "You are offering us a leash," Ethan said quietly, once the terms had been fully explained. Threl Kane tilted its head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity, or something closer to amusement. "We are offering you time to grow beyond the tendencies that define your species. Every civilization we have encountered required a period of guidance before joining us as equals. Yours will be no different. Laura studied the being's expression, searching for any sign of flexibility, any opening for negotiation. She found none. And if we refuse these terms, then you remain outside, Threl Khan said simply, isolated, unprotected, left to face the wider galaxy without our support, without our knowledge, and without our patience, should conflict find you regardless. The threat was never spoken directly, yet everyone in that room understood it clearly. Refusal meant standing alone in a universe that had suddenly become far larger and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined the day before. Before the shuttle departed the alien vessel, Threl Khan requested one final private word with Laura. Ethan hesitated near the doorway, unwilling to leave her alone with the being, but she gave him a small nod, and he stepped back into the corridor. "You are troubled," Threl Khan observed, studying her with those dark, calculating eyes. "I'm cautious," Laura corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" The being tilted its head again. "In my experience, caution and fear often wear the same face on your kind." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe we've learned that trust has to be earned, not demanded." Threl Khan was silent for a long moment, as if turning the words over carefully. "You speak as though your species has earned much of anything. Your history is a record of conflict repeating itself, generation after generation. Over resources you could have shared, over borders drawn in ink rather than reason. Tell me, diplomat, what exactly should we trust?" Laura felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "You've watched us fight. Have you watched us build hospitals in the middle of war zones? Have you watched strangers pull each other from collapsed buildings after disasters, with no reward waiting for them? You've studied our worst moments. I wonder if you've studied our best ones with the same attention." For the first time, something shifted in Threl Khan's expression, though whether it was interest or simple calculation, she could not tell. "Perhaps," it said finally, "perhaps not enough. That is precisely why the Council insists on a period of observation before granting full standing. Prove the pattern wrong, and the terms may change in time. And if we don't get that chance to prove it, if every move we make is filtered through the assumption that we're already failing." Threl Khan did not answer directly. Instead, it turned toward the wide window overlooking the curve of the earth below, city lights scattered like scattered embers across the darkened half of the planet. "That," it said quietly, "is the question every species must answer for itself, once it realizes it is being watched." The words stayed with Laura long after she returned to the shuttle, long after the ship began its descent through the atmosphere. She did not share the exchange with the rest of the delegation, not because it was secret, but because she was not yet certain what it meant. Somewhere within that brief, cold conversation, she sensed something the Council itself might not have intended to reveal: uncertainty, a crack, however small, in an otherwise flawless mask of superiority. When the delegation returned to Earth, the debate that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Every government scrambled to interpret the offer, weighing the promise of advanced technology against the cost of surrendering their independence to an outside authority. News networks broadcast the terms around the clock, streets filled with crowds, some cheering at the thought of ending poverty and disease, others gathering in quiet fear of what it meant to answer to something beyond their own world. Inside private meeting rooms, away from the cameras, the tone was far more guarded. Military leaders from rival nations found themselves seated at the same table for the first time in living memory, not as enemies, but as a single fractured species suddenly aware of how small it truly was. Nobody trusted the Council entirely. Nobody wanted to reject an offer that could end centuries of suffering. And nobody could agree on which risk was greater. After weeks of negotiation, exhaustion, and no small amount of desperation, the nations of Earth voted to accept the Council's terms. It was not a vote made with confidence. It was a vote made with the quiet hope that time and patience might soften what felt like a cage disguised as a gift. Laura remembered standing on a balcony that evening, watching one of the Council's ships drift silently across the darkening sky. It moved without sound, without effort, a reminder hanging permanently over every city on the planet. She thought of the promise of cured diseases and clean water for every child on Earth, and she tried to feel hopeful. But somewhere beneath that hope, a quieter feeling had already begun to take root. It was the feeling of being watched by something that had already decided, long before any conversation began, exactly what kind of species humanity was. Ethan found her there a few minutes later, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the same slow-moving light in the sky. "You don't look like someone who just secured the deal of the century," he said. "I keep thinking about how he said it," Laura replied. "Guidance, like we're children who need to be corrected." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Maybe we are, to them. Maybe that's exactly how they see every species before they let them in. And if they're wrong about us? He didn't answer right away. Somewhere above them, the alien vessel continued its silent orbit, patient and unblinking, watching a planet that had just agreed to prove itself worthy of a place among the stars. Neither of them could have known, standing on that balcony beneath a sky that no longer felt entirely their own, that the true test of humanity's worth had not yet begun. The agreement was only the opening move in a much longer, much darker game, one that would ask more of Earth than any treaty could measure, and one that would ultimately force the entire species to answer a single, unavoidable question. What happens to a people who are told, again and again, that they are simply not enough? The broadcast cut across every screen on the planet at once, without warning, without permission. Laura Bennett was in the middle of a meeting when the room's monitors flickered and switched to a live feed from orbit. She froze mid-sentence, staring at the image of Threl Khan, standing before a gathered assembly of council representatives, their strange faces arranged in rows behind him like judges at a trial. "For 6 months, Threl Khan announced, his voice carrying across every language on Earth simultaneously, the species known as humanity has operated under provisional membership within our alliance. It is time to assess their progress." A murmur spread through the meeting room. Laura's stomach dropped. Nobody had warned them this evaluation would be broadcast publicly, to Earth, and to every other member species watching from their own worlds. Threl Khan continued without hesitation. "The results are, unfortunately, consistent with our initial concerns. Weapons development continues to be reported late or not at all. Regional conflicts persist across their territories. Resource distribution remains uneven, despite the medical and energy technology already provided. In short, this species remains fractured, undisciplined, and unable to organize itself beyond narrow self-interest." The camera panned briefly to the assembled council members, several of whom exchanged glances that even without translation looked unmistakably like judgment. Then Threl Khan delivered the line that would echo across Earth for years to come. "Humanity is, by every measurable standard, a weak species, weak in unity, weak in discipline, weak in vision beyond its own borders. We recommend continued restriction of their expansion privileges, and an extension of the observation period indefinitely." The broadcast ended as abruptly as it began, leaving billions of people staring at blank screens in stunned silence. Laura sat frozen in her chair for a long moment, before Ethan Carter burst into the room, his face pale with fury. "Did you see that? Did you hear what he called us? On every channel, in every country, in front of every species out there?" "I saw it," Laura said quietly. "They didn't even warn us. They didn't give our government a chance to respond first. They just humiliated an entire planet in front of the galaxy." Within hours, the fallout began. Stock markets wavered. Protests broke out in major cities, though nobody could quite agree on who exactly they were protesting against, the council above them, or the governments who had accepted these terms in the first place. Talk shows and news programs replayed the word weak over and over, dissecting it, debating it, until it seemed to hang in the air over every conversation happening anywhere on the planet. What the council had not expected, and perhaps could not have predicted, was the way that single word began to work its way beneath the skin of an entire species. Shame curdled slowly into something else, something sharper. In private government chambers across dozens of nations, leaders who had spent their careers opposing one another began exchanging quiet, careful messages. It started small. A diplomat from one country reaching out to a rival counterpart, not through official channels, but through a personal contact built over years of formal hostility. A simple question passed between them. "Did you see the broadcast too?" Within a week, something unprecedented began to take shape. Military attaches from nations that had not spoken cooperatively in decades found themselves seated together in a windowless room beneath a government building, none of them officially acknowledging why they were there, all of them understanding perfectly well. Ethan was one of the first to be summoned to such a meeting. He arrived expecting hostility, old rivalries dressed up as formality, and instead found something closer to exhausted recognition among the assembled officers. A general from a country his own nation had been in tense standoff with for a generation looked him directly in the eye and said only, "We've been called worse by each other, never by something that isn't even from this planet." The room fell into an uneasy, unfamiliar quiet, the kind that comes before people decide to trust each other for reasons stronger than comfort. Laura, meanwhile, found herself increasingly sidelined in official diplomatic channels, her earlier openness toward negotiation with the council, now viewed with suspicion by colleagues who wanted nothing more than to lash out. She understood the anger. She felt it too, sharp and constant beneath her ribs. But she also remembered the cracks she had glimpsed in Threl Khan's mask during their private conversation months earlier, and she wondered if the council's harsh judgment was less a settled fact and more a test, deliberately designed to provoke exactly the kind of reaction now spreading like wildfire across the planet. She requested another audience with Threl Khan, and to her surprise it was granted. This time, the alien met her not aboard the Grand Assembly ship, but in a smaller vessel hovering above the city where she lived. The chamber was quieter, more private, without the weight of an audience watching. "You wish to speak," Threl Khan said. "You knew exactly what that broadcast would do," Laura said, skipping any formal greeting. "You knew it would humiliate us. You knew it would spread through every household on the planet within minutes." "I knew it would provoke a reaction," Threl Khan admitted, with no trace of apology in his tone. "Reaction reveals character. Character reveals potential. We have found, across many species, that comfort breeds complacency, while pressure reveals what a civilization is truly capable of becoming." "So this was a test," Laura said, her voice tightening. "You called an entire species weak, in front of the whole galaxy, just to see what we would do about it?" "Among other reasons, yes," Threl Khan replied. "Species that fracture further under pressure are typically deemed unfit for advancement. Species that unify, even reluctantly, even out of anger rather than trust, often demonstrate the foundation necessary for genuine cooperation later." Laura stared at him, a slow, uneasy realization settling over her. "And which outcome are you seeing from us so far?" For a long moment, Threl Khan did not answer. Then, finally, something in his tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "That," he said, "remains to be determined. Reports from our observation fleet indicate unusual movement among your governments. Meetings between historic rivals. Communication patterns your species has not exhibited in recorded memory. It is noted." Laura left that meeting with more questions than answers, but one thing had become unmistakably clear to her. Whatever the council believed it was testing, it had underestimated exactly how deep that provocation would cut, and exactly how far a wounded, humiliated species might be willing to go once it decided its dignity was worth more than the gifts being dangled in front of it. Back on the ground, the quiet meetings between former rivals had begun to take a more defined shape. It was Ethan who first proposed the idea aloud, sitting at a table surrounded by officers and engineers from a dozen different nations, all of them united by nothing but shared anger and shared curiosity about the technology sitting in orbit above their heads. "They gave us pieces," Ethan said, spreading a set of technical schematics across the table, recovered fragments of council technology that had been shared as part of the original agreement, though heavily restricted and incomplete. Energy systems. Medical devices. Fragments of something bigger. What if we stopped waiting for them to hand us the rest and started figuring it out ourselves? A scientist from a rival nation, a woman with sharp eyes and little patience for diplomacy, leaned forward. "You're talking about reverse engineering technology from a civilization that could likely erase this entire planet without much effort. I'm talking about not sitting still while they decide, over and over again, that we're not worth their respect," Ethan said. "We've spent 6 months proving we can be quiet. Maybe it's time we proved we're not as helpless as they think." Nobody in that room said the word rebellion aloud. Nobody needed to. It hung there anyway, unspoken but unmistakably present, in the careful glances exchanged between people who, 6 months earlier, would never have imagined sitting at the same table. Over the following weeks, that unofficial gathering grew into something far more organized, far more deliberate. Word spread quietly through military and scientific circles across the globe, always through trusted channels, always avoiding anything that might alert the Council's ever-watching observation fleet. Engineers who had spent careers designing fighter aircraft now found themselves studying alien alloy samples under low light, comparing notes with colleagues who, in another life, might have been their enemies on a battlefield. It became known, among the small circle who understood its true purpose, simply as the Initiative. No official name, no official funding trail, no official existence at all, at least not on paper. The Initiative's first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young engineer named Daniel Pierce, barely 30 years old and largely unknown outside his small research team, had spent the past 2 years studying the medical scanning devices the Council had provided as part of the original agreement. Officially, his work was limited to using the devices, not understanding their inner mechanisms. Unofficially, curiosity had gotten the better of him long before the broadcast ever aired. Daniel discovered that the scanning devices relied on a form of energy manipulation far beyond anything human science had achieved, yet the underlying mathematics, once properly mapped, followed patterns that were not entirely unfamiliar. It was, he realized, an extension of principles human physicists had theorized about for decades but never had the tools to test. The Council had not given humanity something entirely foreign. They had given humanity a glimpse of where its own science might have eventually arrived, decades or centuries down its natural path. When Daniel presented his findings to the growing circle around Ethan and Laura, the room fell into a stunned silence. "You're telling us," Laura said slowly, "that we could have figured this out ourselves eventually?" "Given enough time, yes," Daniel said. "They didn't hand us magic, they handed us a shortcut, and shortcuts can be studied, understood, and eventually replicated, if you know what you're looking at." The revelation changed the tone of the Initiative entirely. What had begun as a quiet act of defiance now carried the weight of genuine possibility. Teams began forming around specific fragments of technology, medical devices, energy cells, communication systems, each one dismantled carefully, studied, documented, and slowly, painstakingly, understood. Progress was slow, and setbacks were frequent. An early attempt to replicate a portion of the Council's energy shielding technology resulted in an explosion that injured 2 researchers and destroyed months of careful documentation. Ethan personally visited both of them in the hospital, sitting quietly beside their beds, absorbing their frustration and disappointment as though it were his own. "We'll get it right," he told them. "We just proved something can go wrong, which means we're close enough to something real." Laura, for her part, took on a role few others in the Initiative could fill. Having spent considerable time in direct contact with Council representatives, she understood the rhythms of their language, the subtle patterns in how they revealed or concealed information. She began compiling detailed notes from her interactions with Threl Khan and other Council officials, searching for any inconsistency, any weakness, any hint of internal disagreement within an organization that presented itself to the galaxy as perfectly unified. She found more than she expected. During a routine diplomatic exchange months earlier, she recalled a moment when a lower-ranking Council official had mentioned, almost in passing, a species called the Virenta, who had once existed on the fringes of Council governance, before quietly disappearing from official records. When she had asked about them, the official had changed the subject with unusual speed, a reaction so immediate it bordered on defensive. Laura raised the memory with the group one evening. What if humanity isn't the first species they've dismissed as weak? What if there have been others who pushed back against these same terms, and the Council simply erased them from the story they tell every new species they encounter? Nobody in the room had an answer, but the question settled over them with quiet, unsettling weight. If it were true, it meant the Council's confidence was not built purely on strength. It was built, at least in part, on controlling the story told to every civilization it encountered, ensuring that no one ever learned what had happened to those who refused to accept their place. Laura learned about it almost by accident, catching a fragment of conversation between Ethan and another officer in a hallway she wasn't meant to be walking through. She said nothing at first, watching him carefully over the following days, weighing whether to report what she suspected or to understand it more fully before making any judgment. Finally, she confronted him directly. "You're building something," she said. "Aren't you?" Ethan didn't bother denying it. "We're done waiting to be told what we're allowed to become. Do you understand what happens if the council finds out? They could end this before it even starts. They could end us." "Maybe," Ethan said, "or maybe they'll finally see something other than weakness when they look down at this planet." Laura studied him for a long moment, torn between the caution that had defined her entire career and the same simmering anger that had settled into nearly everyone she knew since that broadcast. Finally, she made a decision that surprised even herself. "If you're doing this," she said quietly, "you're going to need someone who understands exactly how far you can push before they notice. Someone who's spent time inside their ships. Someone who's heard the way they actually talk about us when they think we're not paying close enough attention." Ethan studied her carefully, then extended his hand. "Welcome to the initiative." Above them, unseen and unaware of exactly how quickly the ground beneath its observation was shifting, the Council's fleet continued its slow, patient orbit, still convinced it held every advantage, still certain that whatever humanity attempted, it would remain, as always, simply too weak to matter. Neither Laura nor Ethan could have guessed, in that quiet hallway conversation, just how wrong that assumption was about to prove itself to be. The explosion tore through the testing facility just after midnight, throwing Daniel Pierce off his feet and shattering every window along the north corridor. For a moment, silence. Then alarms, shouting, the smell of burning metal thick in the air. Ethan Carter was already running before the second alarm even sounded, sprinting down a hallway filled with smoke toward the lab where the initiative's most sensitive equipment was housed. He found Daniel sitting against a wall, dazed but alive, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. "It worked," Daniel said, coughing through the smoke. "Right before it blew up, it worked. We had containment, actual containment." It had taken nearly a year of failures to reach that single moment of success, a year of setbacks that would have broken the resolve of a less determined group. But something had shifted within the initiative over those months, something beyond simple defiance. It had become a shared purpose, one strong enough to survive injuries, funding shortages, and the constant fear of discovery. That fear was not unfounded. 6 weeks after the explosion, Laura Bennett received an urgent summons to appear before Threl Khan aboard the primary council vessel. She arrived with her stomach in knots, certain their secret had finally been uncovered. Threl Khan did not waste time with pleasantries. "Unusual energy signatures have been detected across multiple regions of your planet," he said. "Signatures inconsistent with your reported industrial or scientific activity." Laura kept her expression carefully neutral. "Earth is a large planet, Ambassador. Industrial accidents happen. Experimental technology fails sometimes. These signatures bear certain similarities to technology, provided under our original agreement," Threl Khan continued, his dark eyes fixed on her with unsettling precision. "Technology your species was explicitly forbidden from studying beyond its intended medical application." Her heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "If you have evidence of a violation, Ambassador, I would expect you to present it rather than speculate." For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Threl Khan's posture shifted, something almost like reluctant respect settling into his expression. "You misunderstand my position, diplomat. I am not here to condemn. I am here to observe, and to report what I observe honestly, regardless of what conclusions the Council draws from it." "Then observe this," Laura said carefully. "A species that has spent the last year quietly setting aside old conflicts to work together for the first time in its history. Whatever those energy signatures mean to you, ask yourself what they might mean to us." Threl Khan studied her for a long moment before responding. "I will report what I have seen. Interpretation, as always, belongs to the full council." He paused, then added something Laura had not expected. "For what it is worth, diplomat, I do not entirely disagree with your species' frustration. That does not mean I have the authority to change how this proceeds." She left that meeting shaken, but oddly hopeful. Whatever cracks existed within Threlkon's composed exterior, they seemed to be widening, however slowly. Back on the ground, news of the near discovery spread quickly through the initiative's leadership, prompting an urgent debate about how to proceed. Some argued for scaling back research entirely, waiting until the Council's attention shifted elsewhere before continuing. Others, including Ethan, argued the opposite. If they already suspect something, slowing down won't undo that suspicion, he said during a tense late-night meeting. It just gives them more time to prepare a response while we sit here doing nothing. We need to accelerate, not retreat. The disagreement grew heated, voices rising around the table until Daniel, still recovering from his injuries, spoke up quietly. There's something else you all need to consider. During the explosion, right before everything went wrong, I picked up something in the readings. A frequency pattern I didn't recognize, buried beneath the Council's own energy signature, almost like an older layer underneath their technology, something that might not have originated with them at all. The room fell silent. What are you suggesting? Laura asked. I'm suggesting, Daniel said carefully, that maybe the Council didn't invent everything they've been handing us. Maybe some of this technology was borrowed, or taken, from somewhere else entirely. The implications settled slowly over the group. If true, it meant the Council's authority over Earth, over every species under its influence, might rest on foundations far less solid than they projected to the galaxy. Over the following months, the initiative expanded its scope beyond simple technological replication. Laura began cross-referencing every historical reference she could find within Council archives made available to Earth's diplomats, searching for any mention of species who had come before, species who had vanished from official records the way the mysterious Virenta had. It was slow, careful work, conducted under constant risk of discovery, but patterns began to emerge. References to civilizations described briefly, then never mentioned again. Trade agreements that simply stopped appearing in records after a certain point. A pattern of silence that felt, the more she studied it, deliberately constructed rather than accidental. Meanwhile, Ethan's engineering teams achieved their first major breakthrough, a working prototype of a defensive energy shield, smaller and far less powerful than anything the Council possessed, but undeniably functional. The first successful test brought the entire research team to their feet in stunned celebration, a moment of triumph that felt, after so many months of frustration, almost unreal. This changes everything, Ethan said, staring at the humming device on the table before him. For the first time since this started, we're not just studying their technology, we're building our own. News of the breakthrough spread cautiously through the wider network of nations now cooperating under the initiative's careful secrecy. What had started as a handful of officers meeting in a windowless room had grown into a coordinated effort spanning dozens of countries, each contributing resources, expertise, and manpower toward a single, unspoken goal, neither openly discussed nor entirely denied. It was during this period of rapid progress that Grace Whitfield entered the story. A brilliant young systems analyst working within one of the initiative's communication divisions, Grace had spent months quietly monitoring patterns in the Council's own internal transmissions, patterns that most researchers had dismissed as background noise, but that she suspected carried hidden significance. She brought her findings to Laura on a quiet evening, her tablet trembling slightly in her hands. I think I found something in their communications, she said, buried deep, encoded in a way that doesn't match their normal diplomatic transmissions. It repeats every few days, always from the same origin point within their fleet. Laura studied the data carefully. Could it be some kind of automated system? A maintenance signal? That's what I thought at first, Grace said. But the pattern shifts slightly each time, almost like a conversation, rather than a fixed broadcast. Whatever it is, someone is actively sending it. And whoever they are, they don't want the rest of the Council to know. The discovery sparked a new phase of the initiative's work, one focused not on technology, but on understanding the internal politics of an organization that had always presented itself to Earth as a single, unified authority. Grace, working alongside a small team of linguists and codebreakers, spent weeks attempting to decrypt the hidden signal, piecing together fragments of meaning from a language structure unlike anything humanity had previously encountered. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. during a routine diplomatic exchange between Laura and a mid-ranking council official named Owen Threll. No relation to Threll Khan despite the similarity in name. A coincidence Laura found faintly unsettling the first time she heard it. Owen had always struck her as more open than most council representatives, occasionally allowing small moments of genuine curiosity to slip through his otherwise carefully guarded demeanor. During one such exchange, Laura mentioned, carefully and indirectly, the strange communication pattern Grace's team had discovered. She watched Owen's expression closely, searching for any reaction. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You should not have found that." "Found what, exactly?" Laura asked, keeping her tone deliberately light. Owen glanced around the chamber, as if checking for observers even in a space he presumably knew to be private. There are those within the council who do not entirely agree with how newer species are treated during their evaluation period. Some of us believe the process has become less about genuine guidance and more about maintaining control. That signal you found is not official council communication. It is something else entirely, a quiet effort among a small number of us to reach out to species being evaluated, to offer perspective the official channels would never permit. Laura's pulse quickened. "You're saying there's division within the council itself?" "I am saying," Owen replied carefully, "that unity, from the outside, is not always the same as agreement from within. Tread carefully with what you now know, diplomat. If the wrong ears hear of this conversation, the consequences would extend far beyond myself." The revelation reshaped the initiative's understanding of their situation entirely. The council was not the flawless, unified authority it presented itself as to the galaxy. It carried its own fractures, its own disagreements, its own quiet dissenters who questioned the very system they served. For the first time since the humiliating broadcast that had started everything, Earth's resistance no longer felt like a lone, desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. It felt, however faintly, like it might not be entirely alone. Ethan received the news with cautious optimism. "Division within their ranks doesn't mean they'll help us," he said during a late-night strategy session. "But it does mean they're not as untouchable as they want us to believe." "It also means we need to move faster," Laura added. "If there are those within the council sympathetic to species like us, there are almost certainly others who would move swiftly to crush any hint of rebellion before it could gain real momentum. We may not have as much time as we thought." Daniel, still working tirelessly on refining the shield technology alongside a rapidly expanding team of engineers, nodded grimly. "Then we stop being careful and start being fast." Over the following weeks, the initiative's pace accelerated dramatically. Prototype after prototype moved from theoretical design to working models. Communication networks, painstakingly built across dozens of previously uncooperative nations, grew more sophisticated, more resilient, more capable of coordinating a response that would need to unfold across an entire planet simultaneously, should the moment ever come. Laura continued her careful, dangerous dialogue with Owen, gathering fragments of information about the Council's internal structure, its weaknesses, its history with other species who had once stood exactly where humanity now stood. She learned that the Virenta, the species mentioned so briefly months earlier, had indeed once existed as a member civilization, until they too had been labeled unfit, restricted, and eventually, according to Ovan's careful and reluctant account, removed entirely from galactic record when they refused to accept an extension of their own evaluation period. "Removed how?" Laura asked, dread settling cold in her stomach. Owen did not answer directly, but his silence told her everything she needed to know. Before returning to the surface, Laura pressed Owen for one final piece of information, aware that each meeting between them carried greater risk than the last. If the Council decided tomorrow that humanity had failed its evaluation, what would happen? Not in vague terms, exactly what would happen. Owen hesitated, glancing again toward the chamber's entrance before answering in a low, careful voice. A formal declaration would be issued, citing the species as unfit for continued engagement. Observation vessels currently stationed above your world would be authorized to enforce what the Council terms a containment protocol. In simpler language, your planet would be sealed off from any further contact, any further trade, any further access to the technology already shared. Your species would be left to face whatever consequences follow, entirely alone. And the Virenta, Laura pressed. Was that all that happened to them? Isolation? Ovan's silence stretched long enough that Laura felt certain he would not answer at all. Finally, quietly, he said, isolation was the beginning. What followed, I was not permitted to witness directly. I know only that no transmission has been received from their system in longer than I have served on this council. Draw your own conclusions, diplomat, and forgive me for not being able to offer more than that. She left the ship that day with a hollow feeling lodged deep in her chest, one she carried with her through every meeting that followed over the next several weeks. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a shape now, however incomplete, and that shape was terrifying enough to make even the most cautious voices within the initiative agree that half measures were no longer an option. Grace's team, meanwhile, continued monitoring the hidden signal, now understanding it not as an isolated curiosity, but as a lifeline extended by a handful of council members who, for reasons of their own conscience or calculation, had chosen to quietly support species facing exactly the fate Laura now feared for Earth. Through careful, coded exchanges, Grace began establishing a fragile channel of trust with these unnamed sympathizers, learning what she could about the Council's fleet capabilities, its command structure, and crucially, its weaknesses. One piece of information proved especially valuable. The observation vessels stationed above Earth, while vastly more advanced than anything humanity had built, were configured primarily for surveillance and diplomatic presence, rather than sustained combat. Their weapons systems, while formidable, had never been tested against a coordinated, technologically capable resistance, because no species evaluated by the Council had ever mounted one. Every previous encounter, whether compliant or defiant, had ended the same way: quiet submission or quiet disappearance. Earth, Grace realized as she pieced together the fragments of information flowing through her carefully guarded channel, would be the first true test of whether the Council's dominance rested on genuine strength, or merely on the fact that no one had ever dared to challenge it directly. She brought this information to the wider group, and for the first time since the initiative had begun, the mood in the room shifted from grim determination to something resembling cautious, dangerous hope. They've never had to fight, Ethan said slowly, turning the implications over in his mind. Every other species just gave up. That's not strength. That's just fear, dressed up as inevitability. It doesn't mean we'd win, Daniel cautioned. Their technology is still generations beyond ours, even with everything we've built. But it does mean the odds aren't quite as impossible as we assumed. Laura looked around the room at the faces that had, over the past year, become as familiar to her as family, each of them carrying the weight of a decision that would affect not just themselves, but every person on the planet below. Then we make sure that when the moment comes, we're not facing them as a handful of scattered nations anymore. We face them as one world, united, for the first time in our history, by something stronger than fear. That night, Laura called an emergency meeting with Ethan, Daniel, and Grace, laying out everything she had learned. The room fell into heavy, uneasy silence as the full weight of their situation settled over them. They're not just testing us, Laura said quietly. They're deciding whether we're worth keeping around at all. And if the Varenta's story is any indication, refusal doesn't just mean isolation. It might mean something far more permanent. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes hard with a resolve that had been building steadily since that first humiliating broadcast so many months ago. Then we stop preparing to defend ourselves quietly, and start preparing to make sure they can't simply erase us, the way they erased whoever came before. The decision, unspoken until that moment, but understood by everyone in the room, had finally been made. Earth would no longer wait patiently to be judged. It would prepare, fully and without hesitation, for the moment when patience would no longer be enough to protect a species the Council had already, quietly and privately, decided was expendable. Above them, the Council's fleet continued its slow orbit, unaware that the quiet, fractured planet beneath it had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no retreat, and no further waiting for permission to determine its own fate among the stars. The formal declaration arrived without ceremony, delivered in the same cold, precise tone that had marked every Council communication before it. Laura Bennett stood in the command center, surrounded by officials from a dozen nations, as Threlkon's voice filled the room one final time. After extensive review, The Council has determined that humanity has failed to demonstrate the discipline required for continued engagement. Effective immediately, all technology sharing agreements are suspended. Containment protocols will be initiated within 72 hours. Your species will be permitted no further contact beyond this point. The room fell into stunned silence, though nobody in that chamber was truly surprised. They had known this moment might come. What they had not fully prepared for was how final it sounded, how absolute, how utterly indifferent to everything humanity had accomplished over the past year in secret. Ethan Carter was the first to speak, his voice steady despite the storm building behind his eyes. 72 hours. That's not a warning. That's a countdown. Laura nodded grimly. Then we stop preparing, and we act. Word spread through the initiative's carefully built network within hours, reaching every corner of the coalition that had quietly formed over the past year. What followed was not chaos, but something far more remarkable. Coordinated, deliberate motion, born from months of planning that had always assumed this exact scenario might one day arrive. Military leaders, who had spent careers preparing for conflict against each other, now found themselves aligned toward a single, unprecedented purpose. Defensive shield prototypes, refined over dozens of failed attempts, were rushed into limited production across secure facilities on every continent. Communication networks, built specifically to coordinate a planet-wide response without alerting the Council's observation systems, activated fully for the first time. Grace Whitfield worked without rest, maintaining contact with the small circle of Council sympathizers who had quietly supported the initiative's efforts. Through her, Earth's coalition learned the exact deployment pattern the observation fleet intended to use during the containment operation, information that would prove critical in the hours ahead. Daniel Pierce, exhausted but resolute, oversaw the final calibration of the shield systems designed to protect key population centers from any potential retaliation. These won't stop a direct, sustained assault, he warned during a final briefing. But they'll buy us time. Time to prove we're not defenseless, and time to make them think twice about how easily this fight will go. As the 72-hour deadline approached, world leaders convened in an emergency session unlike any in human history. Every nation, regardless of past rivalry, regardless of political division, sat within the same virtual chamber, united by a single, unavoidable choice: submit to isolation and an uncertain, possibly permanent fate, or reject the Council's judgment entirely and risk everything on the belief that humanity's fractured, chaotic nature might also be its greatest, most unexpected strength. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. For the first time in recorded history, every nation on Earth agreed on something completely, without hesitation, without compromise. Humanity would not submit. The formal rejection was transmitted to the Council's fleet exactly 6 hours before the containment deadline, carried in a message crafted personally by Laura, chosen for the weight her words might carry, given her long history of direct contact with Threl Khan. "You called us weak," the message read. "You judged us, before you ever understood us. You watched our worst moments, and called them our whole story. We reject your evaluation, and we reject your terms. Whatever comes next, it comes because you left us no other choice." The response, when it arrived, carried none of the calm detachment that had defined every previous Council communication. Threl Khan's voice, still measured, still precise, carried an unmistakable edge of something new. "You understand what this rejection means." "We understand," Laura replied, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. "We understand exactly what it means, and we're prepared regardless." The containment fleet began its approach less than an hour later. What followed would later be remembered, across every history book and every retelling for generations, as the first true test of humanity's capacity for coordinated, desperate defiance. The Council's vessels moved with the same slow, confident precision they had always displayed, clearly expecting no resistance beyond scattered, ineffective protest. They were wrong. As the first observation vessel moved to establish a blockade above the Eastern Hemisphere, it was met not with surrender, but with a coordinated strike from a dozen hidden ground installations, each one firing modified versions of the shield technology, repurposed under Daniel's careful guidance into a crude but effective disruption weapon. The vessel's systems flickered violently, its smooth, confident movement stuttering for the first time since it had entered Earth's atmosphere months earlier. Aboard the primary command vessel, Threl Khan watched the readings with something approaching genuine shock. No species evaluated by the Council had ever mounted anything beyond token resistance. Certainly none had possessed functioning countermeasures against Council technology. Technology assumed to be centuries beyond anything a species like humanity could hope to replicate. "Status report," Threl Khan demanded, his composed tone fracturing slightly for the first time in recorded memory among those who served alongside him. "Multiple vessels reporting system disruptions," came the reply. "Source appears to be coordinated ground-based technology, structurally similar to systems originally provided under the Medical Technology Agreement." Threl Khan's dark eyes narrowed. They had built weapons from what the Council had given them to heal. Across the planet, the resistance continued with a ferocity that caught the Council's fleet entirely off guard. Ethan personally coordinated ground operations from a hardened command bunker, watching real-time reports flood in from installations across every continent. Losses were significant. Several ground facilities were destroyed entirely in the opening hours, their defenders overwhelmed by the sheer technological gap between human and Council capabilities. But for every facility lost, 2 more managed to land meaningful blows against a fleet that had never once, in its long history of evaluations, faced genuine resistance. "They're adapting faster than projected," came a report from one of the Coalition's senior military analysts, studying the shifting patterns of the Council fleet's movements. "Their tactics are built around overwhelming force against passive or fragmented targets. They don't know how to fight something coordinated." Ethan allowed himself a grim, exhausted smile. "Then let's make sure they keep learning that lesson." Grace, meanwhile, maintained constant contact with the small network of Council sympathizers who had quietly supported the initiative from within. Through fragmented, urgent transmissions, she learned that the sudden, coordinated resistance had triggered exactly the kind of internal debate among Council leadership that Oven had hinted at months earlier. Some among the wider alliance of species argued for an immediate, overwhelming escalation, determined to crush Earth's defiance before it could inspire similar resistance elsewhere. Others, watching the unprecedented events unfold, began quietly questioning whether the Council's entire evaluation system, built on assumptions of inevitable submission, had ever truly reflected fairness rather than simple, unchallenged dominance. Laura, working alongside Grace to interpret these fragmented signals, recognized an opportunity buried within the chaos. "If there's division building within the Council itself, we need to make sure the rest of the galaxy sees exactly what's happening here. Not just that we're resisting, but why." Working through the night, Laura crafted a message unlike any Earth had ever sent, addressed not to the Council leadership, but to every species connected through their vast communication network. In it, she laid out humanity's story plainly, honestly, without exaggeration. The offer that had arrived as a gift wrapped around a leash, the humiliation broadcast to the entire galaxy without warning or context. The quiet, desperate work of an entire fractured species learning, for the first time in its history, to set aside old wounds in pursuit of a future it refused to have dictated by an outside power. And finally, the story of the Verenta, a warning about what silence and submission had cost a species that came before. The message was transmitted through every available channel, amplified by the same hidden network of sympathizers who had supported the initiative from its earliest days. Within hours, it had reached corners of the galaxy no human voice had ever touched. The response was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Some species, long accustomed to Council authority, dismissed the message as desperate propaganda from a doomed, insignificant world. Others, however, particularly those who remembered their own uneasy evaluation periods, found themselves listening with far greater attention than the Council had ever anticipated. Aboard the primary command vessel, Threl Khan received reports of the growing unrest with visible unease, an emotion Laura would once have believed him incapable of displaying. The battle above Earth had settled into an uneasy standoff, neither side able to claim decisive victory, both sides aware that the true consequences of this confrontation now extended far beyond the fate of a single stubborn planet. It was during this fragile standoff that Threl Khan requested, for the first time since the conflict began, a direct and private conversation with Laura Bennett. "You have caused considerable disruption," he said, his tone carrying none of its usual detached confidence. "We've caused exactly what you provoked," Laura replied, refusing to soften the truth of it. "You called us weak because you believed weakness meant fractured, undisciplined, incapable of unity. You never considered that unity might arrive not through comfort, but through shared defiance." Threl Khan was silent for a long moment. The council did not anticipate this outcome. "No," Laura said. "I don't imagine you anticipated much of anything, considering how easily every species before us simply gave up." Something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, in Threl Khan's expression. "You are aware, of course, that this conflict cannot continue indefinitely without significant loss on both sides." "We're aware," Laura said. "We're also aware that we're not the only ones watching this conflict closely right now. Every species connected to your network is watching exactly how the Council responds to a world that refused to simply disappear quietly." For the first time since Laura had known him, Threl Khan appeared genuinely uncertain about what came next, a crack finally widening fully across a mask that had once seemed utterly unbreakable. Meanwhile, on the ground, the human coalition faced a decision of its own. The standoff, while a remarkable achievement against overwhelming odds, could not be sustained forever. Resources were dwindling. Facilities damaged in the opening hours of the conflict remained only partially repaired. Ethan gathered the remaining leadership of the initiative in a tense, exhausted meeting, laying out the stark reality of their position. "We've proven we can fight," he said, his voice hoarse from days without proper rest. "We haven't proven we can win outright, not against their full capability if they decide to stop holding back." "Do we think they're holding back?" Daniel asked. Grace nodded slowly. "Based on everything coming through my contacts, yes. There's genuine disagreement up there about how far to escalate. Some voices are pushing for exactly the kind of overwhelming force that ended things quickly for species like the Vurenta. Others are urging caution, worried about exactly what Laura predicted, that the rest of the galaxy is watching how this plays out." Ethan rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. "Then our job right now isn't just holding the line militarily. It's making sure that hesitation up there has enough time and enough reason to win out over escalation." The coalition shifted its strategy accordingly, moving from broad, aggressive counterstrikes toward a more measured, deliberate defense, one designed to demonstrate capability and resolve without provoking the kind of overwhelming response that could end the conflict permanently in the Council's favor. Ground installations were reinforced rather than expanded. Engagements became more selective, targeting specific vulnerabilities in the fleet's deployment, rather than attempting broad, costly offensives. The strategy proved effective. Days stretched into a tense, uneasy rhythm of limited skirmishes and careful restraint on both sides, each waiting for the other to either escalate or retreat first. Throughout it all, Laura maintained careful, cautious contact with Threl Khan, searching for any sign that the internal divisions Grace had reported were beginning to shift the Council's overall position. That sign, when it finally came, arrived not through Threl Khan directly, but through Oven, who managed to reach Grace's network with an urgent, hastily encoded message. A formal session of the wider Council Assembly had been called, one that would determine, once and for all, how the organization intended to respond not just to Earth's continued resistance, but to the growing unrest spreading among other member species who had begun openly questioning the fairness of the entire evaluation system. "This is it," Laura said, reading the message aloud to the assembled leadership. "Whatever happens in that session decides everything, not just for us, for every species that's ever been told they weren't good enough to matter." Ethan studied her carefully. "Then we need to make sure our voice is heard clearly, one final time, before that vote takes place." Working through what remained of the night, Laura and Grace crafted one final transmission, addressed directly to the full Council Assembly, timed to arrive just before the critical session began. It was not a plea for mercy, nor a declaration of continued defiance alone. It was, instead, a simple, direct challenge, one aimed squarely at the foundation of everything the Council claimed to represent. If the Council existed to guide emerging species toward genuine partnership, Laura's message argued, then it needed to demonstrate that guidance meant something more than quiet elimination of anyone who failed to submit without question. Humanity was prepared to keep fighting for as long as necessary, but it was equally prepared, given a genuine, fair opportunity, to prove that its chaotic, fractured nature was not a weakness to be corrected, but a resilience earned through struggle the Council itself had never had to endure. The transmission was sent, and then there was nothing left to do but wait, the entire fate of a species now resting on the outcome of a debate, happening in a chamber none of them could see, among voices none of them could fully influence any further. The ground shook as another Council vessel broke formation directly above the command bunker, its weapon systems charging with a low, building hum that every person in that room recognized instantly. Ethan Carter gripped the edge of the console, watching the readings spike toward a threshold none of their defenses had been tested against. "They're not holding back anymore," a technician called out, panic edging into her voice. Laura Bennett stood frozen for half a second, the weight of every decision that had led to this exact moment pressing down on her chest. Then she moved, grabbing the emergency channel. "Grace, tell me the vote happened. Tell me something changed up there." Silence answered her, static crackling faintly across the line. Then, abruptly, the charging weapon above them powered down. The room held its breath as the vessel drifted to a stop, hovering motionless above the bunker, neither advancing nor retreating. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before Grace's voice finally broke through the silence, breathless and urgent. "The vote happened," she said. "It's close. It's not over. But the escalation order didn't pass. Not yet." Relief flooded the room, but it was fragile, temporary, nowhere near the certainty anyone desperately wanted. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands finally loosening their grip on the console. "Not yet" isn't the same as never. "No," Laura agreed. "But it's time. And right now, time is the only thing that might actually save us." Aboard the primary command vessel, Threl Khan stood before the full Council assembly, watching the aftermath of a vote that had shaken the foundation of an organization that had never once, in its long history, faced this level of open disagreement among its own ranks. The escalation order, the one that would have authorized overwhelming unrestrained force against Earth's remaining defenses, had failed by the narrowest of margins. A council elder, ancient even by the standards of the assembly, addressed Threl Khan directly following the vote. "You have observed this species more closely than any other member of this council. Speak plainly. What do you believe humanity truly is?" Threl Khan considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever he said next would carry weight far beyond this single moment. "I believed when this evaluation began that humanity's chaos represented a fundamental weakness, an inability to organize itself toward shared purpose. I have since observed that same chaos transform, under pressure, into something far more complex. Not order in the way this council has always defined it, but resilience, built through struggle, rather than granted through comfort. I do not know if that makes them ready for full partnership among us. I know only that dismissing them as simply weak was, at minimum, an incomplete assessment." The elder studied him for a long moment. "And if this council chooses to finish what the failed vote nearly authorized, if overwhelming force is deployed regardless of today's outcome?" Threl Khan hesitated, something shifting behind his composed exterior that had never been visible before. "Then I believe this council would prove, beyond any doubt, exactly what humanity's message to the wider galaxy already suggested, that our guidance was never truly about growth. It was about control, maintained through the quiet elimination of anyone who refused to accept it without question." The chamber fell into tense, uneasy silence following his words, a silence that carried more weight than any argument that had preceded it. Back on Earth, the fragile pause in hostilities allowed the coalition a brief, desperately needed opportunity to regroup. Daniel Pierce worked around the clock alongside his exhausted engineering teams, refining the shield technology that had proven, against all expectation, capable of holding against a fraction of the Council's true capability. Reports from damaged installations across the globe painted a grim picture of the cost already paid, cities partially evacuated, infrastructure strained near breaking point, and a population caught between exhausted fear and a stubborn, unexpected pride in what their fractured, divided world had somehow managed to accomplish together. Laura, meanwhile, maintained constant contact with both Grace's hidden network and, cautiously, with Threl Khan directly, searching for any sign of which direction the council's internal debate might ultimately settle. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, each passing hour carrying the possibility that the fragile pause might end as abruptly as it had begun. It was during this tense period of waiting that an unexpected development shifted the balance entirely. Word reached Grace's network of a second species, one the Council had quietly evaluated decades earlier and ultimately restricted under terms similar to those offered to Earth, openly declaring support for humanity's resistance. Their message, transmitted across the same wide communication network Laura's original broadcast had reached, was brief but unmistakable in its implications. "We watched a species called Earth refuse to disappear quietly," the message read, according to the fragments Grace managed to decode. "We remember what it cost us to accept the terms we were given. We will not remain silent, while another world is asked to pay the same price we did." Within days, similar messages began arriving from other corners of the galaxy, some cautious and indirect, others bold and unmistakable in their support. What had begun as a single, desperate planet's rejection of unfair judgment had, almost accidentally, become the spark for a far wider reckoning within the Council's sprawling sphere of influence. Species long silent about their own uneasy histories with the organization began, for the first time, speaking openly about grievances that had simmered quietly for generations. Aboard the command vessel, the pressure on Council leadership grew immense. What had started as an internal disagreement over how to handle a single defiant world had transformed into a crisis threatening the very legitimacy of the Council's authority across its entire sphere of influence. Threl Khan requested one final meeting with Laura, arriving this time not aboard his own vessel, but in a small shuttle that landed quietly near the command bunker itself, an unprecedented gesture that immediately signaled how dramatically circumstances had shifted. Laura met him personally, flanked by Ethan, both of them wary but cautiously hopeful, as Threl Khan stepped from the shuttle, his usually composed expression carrying something that looked, for the first time since Laura had known him, almost like genuine uncertainty. "The Council has reached a decision," he said without preamble. "The formal evaluation of humanity, as originally structured, has been suspended indefinitely." Laura felt her breath catch. Suspended, not ended. "The Council does not move quickly, even now," Threl Khan admitted, "but the terms under which any future evaluation might proceed will be entirely different from those originally offered. Humanity will not be asked to submit to observation and restriction as the price of eventual acceptance. Instead, a formal dialogue has been proposed, one conducted between equals rather than between judge and subject." Ethan studied him carefully. "And what changed your mind? Really?" Threl Khan was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I did not change alone. Enough voices within this council, faced with the possibility of losing legitimacy across every species we claim to guide, finally acknowledged what a small minority among us had argued for a very long time. That true strength is not measured by how completely a species submits to authority, but by how resiliently it holds to its own values when everything is stacked against it. Humanity demonstrated that resilience more clearly and more completely than any species we have encountered in recorded memory." Laura allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a genuine, exhausted smile. "So we were never actually weak. We were just never given a fair chance to show what we were capable of." "Perhaps," Threl Khan said, something almost gentle entering his tone for the first time since they had met. "Or perhaps weakness and strength were never as simple as this council once believed them to be." The formal ceasefire was announced to the entire planet within hours, met with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious celebration, unlike anything Earth had experienced in its long, turbulent history. Streets that had spent months gripped by fear and uncertainty filled instead with quiet, disbelieving gratitude. Entire cities gathering to watch as council vessels, once symbols of looming threat, began withdrawing to a respectful distance above the planet they had so recently threatened to isolate entirely. In the weeks that followed, Laura found herself once again seated across from Threl Khan, though the dynamic between them had shifted entirely from their earliest, tense encounters. This time, they met not as evaluator and subject, but as representatives beginning the long, careful work of building something neither species had ever truly attempted before. A partnership built on mutual respect, rather than assumed hierarchy. There will be difficult negotiations ahead, Threl Khan admitted, during one such meeting. Not every voice within the council has fully accepted this new direction. Old habits, old assumptions, do not disappear simply because a single evaluation ended differently than expected. We understand that better than you might think, Laura replied. We spent our entire history learning that change rarely comes easily, and even more rarely comes completely. But we've also learned that it does come, eventually, when enough people refuse to accept that things must always stay exactly as they've always been. Ethan, standing nearby, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he watched the exchange. The initiative that had begun in a windowless room, born from anger and humiliation, had grown into something far larger than any of them could have imagined that first tense night. It had become the foundation of an entirely new relationship, not just between Earth and the Council, but between humanity and itself, a fractured, chaotic species that had finally discovered what it could become when it stopped waiting for permission to prove its own worth. Daniel Pierce, meanwhile, continued his work refining the shield technology that had once been humanity's desperate, improvised defense, now repurposed as the foundation for legitimate, sanctioned research conducted openly, alongside council scientists eager to understand exactly how a species with such limited resources had managed to hold its ground against overwhelming odds. What had once been a secret, dangerous act of defiance had become, remarkably, a source of genuine scientific curiosity and mutual respect. Grace's careful, dangerous work maintaining contact with council sympathizers evolved into something entirely different as well. An official diplomatic channel, now openly encouraging exactly the kind of cross-species dialogue that had once existed only in the shadows, hidden from an authority that no longer sought to suppress such conversations, but instead began, cautiously, to encourage them. In the wider galaxy, the effects of Earth's defiance continued to spread in ways none of them could have fully predicted. The species that had first broken its silence in support of humanity soon found itself joined by others, smaller, quieter civilizations who had spent generations accepting the Council's judgment as an unchangeable fact of existence. Slowly, cautiously, a new kind of conversation began taking shape across the network of worlds connected by the Council's reach, one no longer built entirely around evaluation and hierarchy, but increasingly around genuine exchange between civilizations who had finally begun to see each other as something closer to equals. Owen, whose quiet courage in sharing information with Laura had carried enormous personal risk throughout the conflict, was eventually recognized publicly for his role in urging the Council toward restraint during its most critical vote. He visited Earth personally in the months following the ceasefire, walking through crowded streets with a curiosity that reminded Laura, oddly, of a child seeing something wonderful for the first time. "You risked everything," Laura told him during one quiet evening together, watching city lights spread out beneath them from a rooftop terrace. "Why? You didn't know how any of this would end." Owen considered the question carefully before answering. "I grew up hearing stories about species who simply vanished from our records, dismissed as failures without anyone ever questioning whether the judgment itself might have been flawed. I did not know how your story would end, diplomat. I only knew I no longer wished to remain silent while it was decided for you by others, who never truly tried to understand what your species was capable of becoming." Grace, meanwhile, found herself increasingly occupied not with hidden signals and dangerous secrets, but with the far more hopeful work of building lasting communication channels between Earth and its newfound allies among the stars. The skills she had developed during the most dangerous months of the initiative, patience, precision, an instinct for finding meaning hidden within complexity, proved just as valuable in this new, more open era as they had during the quiet resistance that preceded it. Daniel's engineering work expanded far beyond its original defensive purpose, evolving into genuine collaborative research, conducted openly between human and council scientists, eager to understand each other's approaches to problems neither civilization had solved alone. He often found himself explaining, to endlessly curious council researchers, that humanity's greatest scientific breakthroughs had rarely come from calm, uninterrupted progress, but instead from exactly the kind of desperate, creative pressure that had defined the initiative's earliest, most difficult days. "You build best when everything feels impossible," one council scientist observed during a visit to Daniel's laboratory, studying rows of equipment that blended human ingenuity with carefully shared alien principles. "Our civilization has rarely faced impossible circumstances in the way yours so often has. Perhaps that difference explains more about both of us than any formal evaluation ever could." Not every consequence of the conflict carried such hopeful weight. Rebuilding efforts continued for years across regions hit hardest during the brief, intense period of open hostility, communities working slowly to repair infrastructure damaged in the fighting, families adjusting to losses that no diplomatic success could ever fully undo. Laura made a point of visiting many of these communities personally throughout the following years, listening carefully to stories of hardship and resilience that reminded her, again and again, exactly why the fight had mattered in the first place, and exactly how much it had genuinely cost. "We didn't win because we were stronger than them," she told a gathering of students during one such visit, years after the ceasefire had first been announced. "We won because we finally stopped being so divided against each other that we couldn't stand together against something far larger than any of our old, tired disagreements. That lesson cost us more than I think any of us fully expected. I hope it's one we never have to relearn the hard way again." Ethan, who had spent the years following the conflict helping establish a new, cooperative framework for planetary defense, built jointly by nations that had once viewed each other with deep suspicion, often reflected on how strange it felt to look back at where everything had truly begun. Not with grand strategy or careful planning, but with a single, humiliating broadcast meant to prove that humanity was too fractured and too weak to ever matter among the stars. "They handed us the very thing that ended up proving them wrong," he said once, during a quiet conversation with Laura, shortly before a diplomatic gathering meant to formally establish Earth's new, equal standing among the Council's wider community of worlds. "If they'd never called us weak in front of the entire galaxy, I wonder if we'd have ever found a reason strong enough to finally stop fighting each other." Months later, standing once again on the same balcony where she had first watched a council vessel drift silently across the night sky, Laura found herself joined by Ethan, both of them older now in ways that had little to do with the calendar, weighed down by everything they had witnessed, and somehow lightened by everything they had ultimately achieved. "Do you ever think about how close it came?" Ethan asked quietly. "How easily this could have ended differently?" "Every day," Laura admitted. "But I think about something else more often. I think about how a single, humiliating broadcast, meant to prove we were nothing more than a hopeless, fractured species, ended up being the exact thing that finally taught us how to become something else entirely." Above them, the council vessels remained, no longer symbols of quiet threat, but of a partnership still being carefully, imperfectly built, between two civilizations who had begun their relationship with judgment, and were slowly learning, one difficult conversation at a time, to replace it with something far more valuable. Earth had been called weak, dismissed as fractured and undisciplined by a power that had never once imagined genuine resistance was even possible. Instead, that same fractured, stubborn, endlessly complicated species had done something no other world under the Council's long shadow had ever managed to accomplish. It had refused to disappear quietly, and in refusing, had changed not only its own fate, but the fate of countless other worlds who now, for the first time in generations, dared to imagine that judgment from above did not have to be the final word on who they were, or who they might still become. The stars above Earth no longer felt like distant, indifferent points of light, watching a small, insignificant world with quiet condescension. They felt, for the first time in human history, like the beginning of a much larger story. One Earth had finally earned the right to help write for itself.